I moved my money before my wife tried to divorce me. When her attorney discovered she'd get nothing, she came crawling back. We had been married for 3.5 years. Married at 29, which felt like a line drawn before the rest of life got messy. I had believed in us, in the kind of soft-spoken promises people make when they don't know better. We'll get through it. We're a team, family first. She, Claire, was the person everyone admired. Messy hair, Rolex when she wanted to show she'd made it, laugh that filled rooms. She was the golden spouse, polished Instagram photos, the right friends, the right charity events. I'd always been the quieter type. I didn't mind fixing the leaky sink or letting her have the spotlight. She once told my sister, "He's steady, that's all you need." I took it as praise. The imbalance wasn't dramatic at first. Small things. She managed the accounts because she loved spreadsheets. She paid the mortgage and asked me to handle the fun money, which, in her mind, was my allowance. She joked about how I'd never be taken seriously in the office without a haircut. I laughed. The first time she forgot my name at a dinner party, not because she genuinely forgot, but because she introduced her friend as my husband, Alex, and then continued talking without glancing at me, I told myself it was stress. The second time it hurt. By month 8, it became another thing to tuck into the long list of disappointments. Over the first 2 years of marriage, I missed a lot. I missed signs because partly, I wanted to believe, and partly, because I was exhausted from holding down a job that paid decently but didn't demand my soul. I earned $285,000 a year at a product role in a mid-stage software company. To others, that sounded enviable. To me, it was a mix of stability and a treadmill. I was steady the way people say. I rarely shouted, rarely made big scenes. When Claire started borrowing money saying, "It's temporary, babe, trust me," I believed her. She borrowed $4,000 here for a last-minute trip. She borrowed $12,500 for a client event. She asked to use my credit card in an emergency and never questioned the receipts. I thought we were partners. I also thought I had time. The early warning signs were small but specific. There were 3 incidents in one summer that stacked like dominoes. First, the borrowing that turned into, "Can you just sign this?" She needed a cosigner for a $47,382 line of credit for a boutique investment she wanted to float with friends. I signed stupidly because she said, "You're safe, Alex, you always are." Second, she decided our joint savings was hers to use for a business proposal she pitched to me as a sure thing. She transferred $9,800 from our emergency fund to an account I didn't understand, and then told me confidently it would be back in 6 months. Third, she started telling people at parties that she handled the money because she was better with numbers. Nobody ever thought to ask me how I felt about any of this. When I brought it up, she smiled and said, "You're so sweet worrying about pennies. Let me handle it, you're being dramatic," she'd say playfully. Friends laughed. Family nodded. The enablers were everywhere. The big betrayal happened in a way that felt methodical. It wasn't a blow-up in the middle of an argument with smashed wine glasses. It was the last straw in a long series of taking and dismissing. On October 2, 2019, Claire announced over brunch that she was filing for divorce. She did it like she was announcing a move, calm, practical, rehearsed. "I can't keep living like this," she said. "I deserve better, you're not the man I signed up for." There was no preface, no "we need to talk," just a flat declaration that implied I'd been warned. She'd been planning, I hadn't seen it. The actual betrayal was worse than the filing. She'd lined up an attorney, a woman named Dana who had a smile that made you apologize for things you hadn't done yet. The first week, Dana mailed a demand letter that accused me of financial mismanagement and selfish behavior. It was a legal kind of humiliation. She requested temporary custody of our golden retriever, weirdly cruel, a restraining financial order to access joint accounts, and an emergency motion to take over the family credit lines. The motion included a narrative, a careful one, snippets about financial irresponsibility and lack of contribution. My contributions, the late nights, the mortgage payments I'd made through direct transfers, the days I'd covered when she was sick, did not appear in that narrative. They took urgency as weapon. She expected me to cave. Everyone expected it. Her friends messaged me as if consoling me, but their messages read differently. "He'll come around. You sure you're not overreacting?" My sister called and said, "Alex, be the bigger person." My father said, "You might want to settle quietly." The advice was uniform. Give in, apologize, minimize the chaos. I tried to reason. I tried to talk. I tried mediation that felt performative. The worst part was watching how confident she was, that she had won before the court ever said anything. She bought a new watch. She visited a real estate agent about a 3-bedroom across town, and asked about my name on the title like it was an afterthought. She told friends with shining certainty, "We're doing what's best for me." It was galling because she'd always said we. While everyone was convinced I'd fold, I was quietly planning a different kind of exit. There's a turning point in these stories. For me, it started in that first month after the filing with insomnia and a tiny, stubborn clarity. I remember the nights lying awake, listing my options like inventory. There were specific, actionable choices in that list. Hire a lawyer, fight it in court, or make sure she couldn't take what she didn't deserve. And I made a quiet decision. I would protect what I had built quietly, methodically, legally. There was no dramatic last argument. There was the small sound of a pen signing documents. I moved my money. It's important to be specific about the numbers because a lot of this story hinges on them. Over the previous 5 years, I'd built a small but solid nest. $420,000 in savings from stock options and salary, a 2016 Honda Civic that I had paid off $7,200, and 50% equity in our house on Maple Street, the house valued at $750,000, my share roughly $375,000 after mortgage and depreciation. I didn't waste time on theatrics. I took the assets I controlled and reorganized them into structures Claire would have to contest in court, but only after consulting with a lawyer I trusted. I'll give short, actionable parts because they read like a checklist, and people always ask about the how. First, I opened a separate entity, a single-member LLC, and a revocable trust with myself as the primary trustee and a professional trust company as the successor trustee. I transferred $210,000 of personal savings into an investment account owned by the LLC and $150,000 into the trust. The house stayed in joint title for optics. I didn't want to give her cause to claim I was hiding assets, but I paid down additional principal on the mortgage using funds the LLC loaned me under a properly documented promissory note. I also quickly moved $25,000 into a safe money account at a credit union that required a 48-hour withdrawal notice. The rest I left deliberately visible in a checking account for daily life. That's the performance of normalcy. On paper and to anyone looking casually, nothing dramatic had changed. In reality, I had removed the lion's share of the liquid nest she expected to grab. I moved with the exact precision of someone who'd been underestimated. Quiet, competent, boring. Claire never checked the LLC's filings. She never read the trust instrument. She assumed I couldn't be the kind of person who planned like that. She assumed only she had the ambition to use forms and signatures. Those assumptions were crucial. The immediate aftermath of my quiet exit was rock bottom in its own way. For the first 2 months after the filings, everything doubled down. Claire escalated motions. She demanded emergency access to our joint accounts, claiming necessity. She called friends and said, "He's being vindictive, he moved our funds and locked me out." People rallied the way people do for the charismatic one. I slept on the love seat in the den, because it felt less dramatic than taking the bed, and because I wanted to avoid the house as much as possible. I had adrenaline and low-grade panic. There were nights where I forgot to eat. There were days I walked past our wedding photo and felt nothing for the person smiling back at the camera. The divorce process took its emotional toll. We were dragged through forms and depositions. There were 5 humiliating incidents that stick out. Her attorney subpoenaing my messages and misquoting my offhand jokes, Claire accusing me in front of a mediator of hiding assets, while she brandished receipts for manicures, her friends siding with her in the waiting room and avoiding eye contact with me, a judge asking if we'd attended counseling. And me receiving an email from my bank that they were freezing certain joint transfers until the court decided. Each one was salt. Each one was another sign she believed she had leverage. Then, and this is critical, I left. Not with some cinematic slam of the door. I walked out one cold Saturday, suitcase and the Civic, and told her I'm done. She looked at me like a tax audit. She didn't look worried. She looked triumphant. In her mind, I had no place to go. She assumed running out of money, the way she always framed me as not managing, would break me. Her friends thought she'd broken me. I let them think it. I used the time to rebuild invisibly. 3 months later, I had a promotion at work that I had been quietly lining up for a year. It came with a title change and a $60,000 raise, pushing my compensation to $345,000. I opened a consultancy under the LLC and took a couple of freelance contracts that doubled my monthly income for the next year. The trust paid dividends from the investments I'd moved into it. I rented a modest 1-bedroom downtown for $1,900 a month and found peace in small rituals. Coffee at 6:30 a.m., the gym at 7, reading until my eyes closed. The life looked quieter, but it was firmer. Time worked for me the way it couldn't if I'd stayed. 6 months after the filing, Claire's carefully curated public life started to show strain. Her boutique project collapsed when her partner turned out to be an empty suit. The line of credit she'd opened with my name on the docs had ballooned to $63,000 due to missed payments and interest. She'd used parts of our joint savings for a business that never paid back. The house she wanted to keep ended up with unexpected repairs and a property tax bill she'd ignored. Within 9 months, she defaulted on a private loan she had taken from an acquaintance for $24,500. Her confidence deteriorated into frantic calls and late-night texts that begged for help, and sometimes recrimination. Then came the motion that flipped the narrative. She retained a new attorney who filed for temporary support and a claim to certain assets. It seemed like a second wave, a last attempt. This is where things became theatrical. She stormed into my office uninvited, left flowers at the apartment with a note that read, "We can't fix this," and texted our mutual friend saying, "He's being unreasonable." She believed she could force the world to reverse course. She believed. At around 60 to 70% through this timeline, roughly 14 months after I had moved my assets, my quiet strategy revealed itself publicly. It wasn't dramatic. It was an HR email that my promotion had been approved, a LinkedIn update, a small press notice about the consultancy I'd started advising. A mutual acquaintance, the owner of a cafe where we'd had a meeting, sent Claire a link to an article. Within days I saw the messages. Her calls went from pleading to demanding. The tone shifted, "You have to help me, you owe me," after everything I did. Her attorney, who had been aggressive, suddenly turned guarded. On the courthouse docket a week later, her counsel filed an emergency motion to compel discovery on an alleged hidden asset transfer. Here's the big reveal and the legal pivot. Dana, her original attorney who loved the moralistic narrative, subpoenaed the trust documents, the LLC filings, and the promissory note that had documented the loan from the LLC to me. When her paralegal opened the trust package, she expected to find shells, fraudulent moves, numbered accounts, obvious laundering. Instead, they found precise legal paperwork, professional appraisals, and a separate signature block that showed the trust had been funded with my premarital assets, and with gains from stock options I'd vesting before the marriage. The trust was properly constructed. The LLC files were clean. The promissory note existed. The loans were lawful, documented, and accounted for. There was no hidden theft. It was all legal planning that I had put in place months before she ever announced the divorce. In court, the fight collapsed into a different kind of exposure. The attorney argued on record that the trust was invalid as a marital asset, and the trust company provided the documents showing I had initiated it before the wedding and funded it partly with premarital proceeds and partly with a specific stock option award that had a vesting schedule tied to my employment prior to our marriage. That award, crucially, had a clause explicitly stating it wasn't community property. There were numbers in the documents: $120,000 in premarital stock proceeds, $210,000 moved afterward into the LLC for operational investments, and $150,000 in the trust. The court could have dragged this out, but the practical fallout hit Claire quickly. The judge denied her emergency motion for access to the trust and limited her ability to seize LLC funds that were already contracted through promissory notes. Her desperation changed shape. It went from confident demands to something rawer. She stopped being sure of the outcome and started being sure she needed me. The first time she showed up at my office uninvited was the day Dana called me with a voicemail that had the wrong tone, not legal but pleading. "We're strapped, Alex, please, you have to help." She used the words she'd used in marriage counseling, "we," like a chant. She called my boss. She called my mother. She called members of her social circle with divorce narratives that issued moral judgments. The social pressure mounted. People who had stood by her began to see the math in their feeds. The cafe owner mentioned my consultancy, a mutual friend posted a congratulatory message about my promotion, and a roommate of a friend casually mentioned the house's tax bill in a message that ended up in Claire's inbox. The scaffolding of her old life was crumbling. What happened next is the part most people think about when they imagine cold justice, the crawling back. It never looks the same on the receiving end. There were 42 messages over a weekend. There were 3 visits to the apartment, one at 10 p.m., one at 2 a.m., and one where she wandered into the lobby of my building and stood in the snow, wearing a thin coat holding a paper cup. She begged. She tried bargaining, emotion, and then anger when those didn't work. "I can't believe you do this to me," she snapped, once voice small, "after everything I did." She pleaded for a loan of $10,000, then begged to use the Civic for a week, then demanded I transfer enough to cover overdue bills of $9,300. Her tone cycled through guilt, accusation, shame. I said nothing much. I replied when I did with the legal language I'd learned to favor. "I don't owe you that." Short. Final. The most effective line I used was "not my problem." 2 words. That stopped people mid-sentence. Her attorney called, then texted, then finally asked for a meeting. That day in the conference room, I sat back and listened to phrases I knew well. "After everything she's done for this family, you have an obligation. It's the moral choice." And I realized how often that moral language is deployed like leverage. I didn't argue morality. I argued facts. I had every document. The promissory note. The trust schedule. The bank statements that showed transfers with dates. When Dana tried to move the conversation toward a settlement, she found the floor much less solid. Claire had expected me to cave because she'd assumed I'd be desperate to avoid public drama. She'd misread me. There was a twist that I hadn't planned for, and that revealed more about Claire than she expected. During discovery, a former friend of hers, someone who had been in her boutique's inner circle, reached out to my counsel. She revealed that Claire had a pattern of financial improvisation, taking money from people and promising returns she had never secured. There were threads of $15,000 loans to exes, unreported credit card debts, and a half-dozen failed ventures where she'd left investors holding the bag. The line wasn't just that she'd tried this once, it was that this was her method. That revelation reframed the judge's perspective from a couple in a mess to a pattern of bad faith transactions. It also explained why some of her friends were suddenly less willing to validate her claims in court. Once the pattern was documented, her comeback panic became plain. She had burned through the tidy reserves she expected to hold. She realized that if she couldn't access our combined assets, she had no buffer. The most humiliating moment for her was the day her landlord posted a late notice on the building's community board after she missed a payment, and someone she knew forwarded the photo to a group chat that included mutual friends and acquaintances. The humiliation spread faster than the sympathy. 2 years later, and this is more concrete than any rhetorical flourish, she had lost the townhouse she had tried to purchase with an $850 monthly mortgage supplement and defaulted on that private loan for $24,500. The boutique was shuttered with $47,000 of unpaid vendor invoices. Her credit score had dipped to the mid-500s. She had moved home with her mother and started seeing a financial counselor whose referral list included several people she had once criticized publicly. Her attorney predictably stopped returning calls. Where I was is the other side of that coin. 2 years after the filing, I had a modest condo I owned outright. I bought it using funds from the LLC under a formal purchase agreement. A steady income with a growing consultancy that generated roughly $95,000 a year in net revenue, and a trust that produced passive income covering my annual costs. I had friends who had stuck by me, a small but meaningful circle who knew the truth. I slept well. I drank coffee in quiet mornings, and I paid my bills on time. I didn't gloat. I went to the gym. I dated someone who wanted to build routines rather than stage photo ops. I found comfort in a life that had fewer flashes but more durability. She came crawling back like someone trying to cash an old check. Her first desperate gambit after the discovery documents was to file a motion for rehabilitation to ask the court for a temporary support arrangement while she got back on her feet. Dana argued it with moral rhetoric. I responded with the trust documents. The judge denied the motion, citing that the trust held premarital assets and that her financial mismanagement undermined a claim of need. The court's language was factual and in its own way merciless. I remember distinctly the first time we crossed paths after the court's decision. It was at a neutral mediation meeting. She stood in the hallway and looked at me with a combination of hatred and something like regret. Her hands trembled. "Please," she said, and for a minute I felt the memory of a girl who loved to dance in the kitchen. Then she asked for a favor I couldn't give, to sign a paper allowing her a one-time payment of $5,000 to cover immediate bills. I considered it for 30 seconds. The lawyer in me thought about future leverage. The human in me thought about the dog we'd once walked together. I said no. Short. Sharp. Final. She left the hallway holding herself like someone holding a damaged thing. I do not pretend to be proud of the tiny human cruelties that come in these moments. There is a remnant of guilt I carry. The time that a neighbor told me he had seen Claire at a food pantry when things had become very thin and I felt like a stone. But I also know that staying would have been catastrophic. Letting her think she could use me as a backstop after she betrayed every trust was not a kindness. It would have been enabling. The real twist, the one that cements the story for me, is what came after. After the court denied her motions and the dust settled, one of Claire's oldest friends called me and said quietly, "She's always been like that. I'm sorry it was me who didn't see it." People apologized. Not enough to erase what had happened. Not enough to buy back lost time. But the apologies were another small justice, recognition. It was little and late, but it was honest. People ask sometimes with a kind of hungry curiosity what I did with the money I moved. Did I spend it on revenge? Buy an extravagant watch? The answer is boring. I paid taxes, I paid down debt, I bought a modest condo, and I kept a cushion. I helped one or two friends in actual emergencies. I invested in a small index fund, and donated $5,000 anonymously to a local legal aid clinic for people going through the courts pro se. I did not throw gloating parties. I moved on. That felt sweeter than any toast. 2 years on, Claire's name will come up in a group conversation like a cautionary tale. People who knew her now hedge a little when they tell stories. My life looks simple to the outsider, stable and without drama. Some nights I think about the list of small choices that saved me. Signing the trust paperwork the week before she had the idea to separate, paying off the Civic, refusing to co-sign on her business partner's credit request without documentation. Those small acts of planning, invisible at the time, turned out to be the difference between being someone who lost everything and someone who had options. The final line most people want is some kind of mic drop, and then they all begged on bended knee. That's not how it was. There were moments, many of them, where she tried to reclaim the narrative. There were Facebook comments and passive-aggressive messages, and at least one awkward encounter at a mutual friend's barbecue where she tried to hug me and I politely stepped back. The satisfaction for me was quieter. Watching a person come to terms with consequences she had manufactured and realizing that the life I wanted, steady work, reliable friends, peaceful mornings, was entirely mine to claim. That quiet is the victory. If you're reading this because you're in the middle of something similar, don't mistake the story for a how-to on revenge. It's not. It's an argument for planning and for not letting other people's moralizing gaslight you into surrender. There is dignity in the small acts that preserve your future. The documents, the signatures, the appointments with a lawyer done quietly and well before you need them. There is power in walking away without spectacle and then building slowly. There is no satisfaction in cruelty, only in safety. I built a life that was small and honest. I paid my bills. I bought a morning I could keep. That's the ending I wanted.